Hello, welcome back to the EGOS map. In this video, we will focus on change and the transformation process. Now, change impacts every country, every business, and that requires companies to adapt to remain competitive. Change can come from political issues such as political polarization or population migrations or terrorism. Other changes can come from the economic arena such as stock market volatility or a financial and economic crisis, or the development of startups and entrepreneurs. And they can also stem from social areas such as health and well-being, like the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as new lifestyles from digital natives, social networks, and even generation gaps. And in the technological areas, there are many changes taking place: artificial intelligence, robotics, advanced robotics, Internet of Things, of course, alternative energies, smart cities. Those are all changes that impact or can impact different businesses. So how can we deal with so many changes at the same time? Obviously, we have to first understand how uncertain are those changes. And the uncertainty actually can be understood better with different patterns. So let's take a closer look at that. There are some high uncertainty patterns and low uncertainty patterns. But there are also some approaches that allow us to have more or less control over that uncertainty, right? So let's take a look at the first uncertainty pattern called unpredictable pattern, meaning it's hard to predict how things will develop in the future, like at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, where it was highly uncertain how it would develop. And the second pattern here is the restricted pattern, meaning there may be one or two directions, like, let's say, an election where there may be two candidates, and it can go in the favor of one or the other. And according to the winner, different policies will be put in place. Another pattern is what is called the comprehensive pattern, meaning two or at most three factors jointly influence various alternative directions. So like technology, for instance, or economic policies, for instance. So sometimes there are a few variables that have a huge impact on the future development of businesses or even countries. And obviously, the most certain pattern is called the predictable pattern, where the future is pretty much an extension of the past. Now, when you look into the future, you realize that technological, economic, social, and political changes can be easily put here on this table so that we understand better which of those changes are actually more uncertain, more difficult to predict, and which ones are actually quite easy to understand how they will evolve in the future. But there's also change inside the company. There's also uncertainty inside the company. Take a look at this example. This was some work we did with a multinational company in the fast-moving consumer goods business. And we took the EGOS map of all the leaders, so many more than there are here presented. But as you can see, the first level, the top leaders, already showed some friction, let's say, some less of cohesion. And when we go deeper into each area, we realize actually that sales is very well organized, very cohesive. Same with operations, well structured. Finance and administrative services and information systems all very well positioned. So this firm, just by looking at the EGOS maps of these functions, you realize that this firm is very well structured from an industrial, commercial, and financial perspective. They have solid margins, they cut the costs well, so they're doing well in terms of holding their profitability. However, once we look at the marketing and technology and product development, we realize that there are really serious shortcomings in two major areas for any fast-moving consumer goods company. Marketing, as you can see, the whole team is pretty scattered. the leader is actually in a good position for the marketing team, but the team is not a team, it's a group. And in the technology and product development function, it's not just a problem of the team being very scattered. Actually, the leader is in a completely inappropriate position for this area in a fast-moving consumer goods company. So these internal requirements for change must also be taken into consideration. This company was solid from a financial and commercial perspective, but not dynamic. So it had to change. It had to transform itself to become a more market-oriented, customer-centric company with a much better marketing and innovation department. So as you can see from this interesting example, a company-wide EGOS map analysis clearly reveals not just strategic, but also organizational issues. And it helps understand in which direction transformation must happen. So now that we know that we need to transform the company to deal with the changes around it or to improve those shortcomings that were identified internally, it's necessary to realize which leadership is the most suited to pursue that transformation. On an ongoing basis, transactional leadership focuses on stabilizing the firm, on optimizing processes, on rewarding people for their appropriate performance. There's not much interaction among everybody because processes are well known, there are rules to be followed. So this kind of transactional leadership is appropriate for stable environments. But if you want to promote change, if you want to transform the company, obviously you need a different approach. The leaders must be change agents and inspire their staff members. There must be a tolerance for mistakes because whenever there's something new to be done, there will be a few mistakes made, but the learning process is actually more important than correcting the mistakes. People are engaged, are involved, there's more interaction so that everybody can take part in developing better solutions at all levels, strategic and operational. And obviously this kind of transformational leadership is the most appropriate for unstable environments. Now, is this easy? Is it easy to pursue a transformation with transformational leadership? Of course not. There will be always resistance to change. Can be emotional, can be rational resistance. And by the way, the emotional one is always the hardest to overcome because it's not always explicit. People do not always express their fears of losing their jobs or fears of losing the status that they already had achieved and so on. So we have to prepare ourselves for this resistance to change. And that means that we should identify who are the opponents, those who have more to lose with changes that we'll undertake. Okay? Those opponents will be highly involved, highly engaged against those changes. There are others who are more skeptical, so they tend to stay on the side and maybe doubt that changes are needed or will succeed, but they will not oppose it. Opponents are the critical ones. So you have to, in advance, understand who are the opponents or the potential opponents so that you can treat them separately so that you can interact more with them in advance and find out under what circumstances would they be willing to at least become skeptical. You're not going to change an opponent into somebody who agrees with change, but you can lower the level of engagement against the change and turn opponents into skeptical. But there are also people who are obviously in favor of change and who benefit from change. They can be promoters of change, let's say the change agents, the leaders who push the change forward, but also supporters who tend to stay on the side and think, yes, this is good, but not actively engage themselves with the change. Now here the trick is, we already know that the promoters are on our side. So we have to bring the supporters out of their, let's say, silent agreements and make them participate more, be more engaged with change, so that they will become also promoters. So the key here is to lower the level of engagement of opponents and increase the level of engagement of supporters. And this helps us understand also why it's so relevant to look at transformation as a process. And each process has various stages. So let's take a look at the first one, admission. Before we change, actually, we need to realize and admit that we need to change. Things are not as well as they should. So in this sense, bad news, problems are actually good for change. Because if people think that everything's going well, there's no reason why they should change. But if they realize that problems are happening, then they are more likely to admit that change is needed. And to involve everybody in this first stage, it's good to have a social engagement, a social, let's say, involvement with everybody, sharing the bad news in the sense that we need to correct this, we cannot go on like this, like complaints from customers, for instance, or information from competitors who are more successful, or difficulties from internal processes that people maybe are not completely aware of. All those bad changes help make the whole company realize that change is needed. And only then comes the second stage, which is preparation. Now, preparation, as you would expect, means you have to diagnose the problems and try to identify the best solutions. So this is a typically G approach, and it's done either by the company itself or by external consultants. So this requires lots of analytical rigor. And the third step, which is actually to bring about change, is the alteration stage. Here, obviously, we need lots of engagement, lots of efforts from everybody, not just from the leaders, of course. There must be a commitment to improve whatever is not well, to change whatever needs to be changed. And the E profile is here the most appropriate, obviously, the sense of not giving up, fighting until we reach the desired goals. And then comes the last stage, where the new approaches, the changes that were being tried out and perfected, now have to become a routine. And that's this consolidation stage. The routines are obviously more associated with the O profile. So once we achieve the desired goals, it's time to make it, let's say, consolidated, to make it happen each time, not a result of some extra effort. It should become the norm, should become normal. Okay? Now we look at this sequence and we realize that all EGOS profiles are helpful in bringing about change. But as most leaders are governors or entrepreneurs, they frequently fail to fully implement the transformation process. Typically, they start in the second stage, the one associated with the G profile, the preparation, with some diagnostic, with some analysis, and then with some recommendations for solutions to be put in place. Well, that's all very nice, but when they have to announce it and make people understand that's the new directives, maybe people will resist change. Why? Because they were not even aware that change was needed. It came, in many cases, as a surprise because they were not informed that something was not going well. And leaders push and push and push, and eventually they get the job done, lots of efforts with an E approach, so the alteration does happen. Guess what? Once the first results are achieved, the leaders think, good, we got to where we wanted to come, we can relax now and move on to another big change. That's exactly the mistake that happens in too many companies, that brings the company back to where it was originally. Because without the engagement, without the acceptance of the change, so with the resistance to change, but with lots of pushing by the top level leadership, once the pressure is off, people go back to doing like they used to. So the consolidation never really happened. It is true that the goals were achieved, but they were not consolidated for the future. They were not turned into a routine. And that's a big mistake in terms of transformation. In any transformation process, there are many individual initiatives that must be undertaken, right? Some are more strategic, some are more organizational. And some will face more resistance to change, others less. Some will have a higher value impact, improving the value of the company. Others, let's say, a medium value improvement. So according to this combination, of course, there are 4 types of projects: more disruptive, more progressive, more transitional, and a few more facilitating. And what's interesting is that different leaders from different EGOS profiles should be in charge of different types of projects. For instance, a change initiative that is clearly disruptive will face lots of resistance to change. You better have an leader for that initiative, because we know if this goes well, it has a high impact in terms of value improvement, but we'll have to face difficulties. On the other hand, if it's another type of high value improvement initiative, such a progression like Kaizen, Six Sigma, Lean initiatives, that will face medium resistance to change, and they will take a longer time to achieve, well, here the Gs are the best. The G leaders should be in charge of these kinds of changes. And if it's an initiative with a small impact, more of a transition, an O leader can do it really well. And if it's more a question of overcoming resistance to change, for us to catch up, for instance, with something that everybody else already did, but we are still holding back, let's put a social leader in charge and make him or her make sure that everybody's on board and overcome those resistance to change. So once again, understanding personalities helps us realize that change must be led by the right kind of leaders in the right approach for the nature of the project that is being put forward. And this is something that we have done for many decades now: integrate people and business to ensure a joint strategic and organizational development. This can be portrayed as an iceberg. Typically, you look at it and you think, well, this looks like a mountain. And there's strategy on the top, strategy formulation, and strategy execution, but actually it's not a mountain. It's an iceberg. And like any iceberg, there's a part below the surface that is actually much bigger than the above one. And in the part below the surface, let's say the hidden part, is the human side. Leaders, teams, employees, culture. So all these topics must be also addressed when we're trying to promote strategic or organizational development. And in any transformation process, if you don't get people involved and aligned, you will have difficulties dealing with resistance to change, and the strategy may not succeed at all. On the other hand, if instead of just looking at the higher level strategy formulation and execution, look at the whole iceberg, and you understand how to deal with people even before the transformation starts, it is very likely that you will succeed.